Hey, it's John and Mike, brew-dudes.com, and this video is all about pressure fermentation. And, you know, now that Mike and I have been experimenting with closed fermentation, well, what's the deal with pressure fermentation? What is the benefit? It seems like a hot topic. It seems like I see things on the internet talking about, well, now I can do pressure fermentation and I'm all psyched about that. That's what I read from someone else, not me. And I say to myself, well, why is that person psyched to do pressure fermentation? So we've been looking into it. I know that other people have probably been, yeah, dude, I've been doing this for 3 years. But here at brew-dudes.com, things move at a glacial pace. We get there. Just slower than...
We don't want to give it too much at one time.
Too fast. You know, just we are kind of like the sloths, getting there when we get there. Any case, the world will pass us by. It'll be all right. We'll still be here on YouTube. So pressure fermentation, where did it come from? Why is it important? And why should you try it out, I guess? Or, well, you know, we're going to get into it. So Mike did a whole bunch of research, and we're going to discuss it now. So I'm just going to yield the floor to Mike. Here we go.
Enjoy your beer.
Okay.
The idea from this originates from what's called hydrostatic pressure. In the professional brew environment, you've got those big cylinder conical tanks.
Sure.
There's a huge water column, essentially. It's, you know, beer, but water column above the yeast, and it's creating hydrostatic pressure. It's just the weight of all that volume pushing down on the yeast creates pressure that actually suppresses yeast growth and yeast activity. And more importantly, from a brewing perspective standpoint, at least from a flavor perspective, it suppresses yeast formation. So if you get a recipe from a pro brewer, they'll often have it listed at like maybe 72 degrees Fahrenheit. And I don't know too many people homebrewing who like intentionally even go to that level. Not that it's bad, but they just don't. Homebrewers tend to ferment at like 65, 68. But the reason for that is because we don't have that kind of hydrostatic pressure. I mean, in a 5-gallon batch, the dynamics on the yeast in a 5-gallon bucket, even a 5-gallon conical, is just nothing like what's happening in the bottom of a 100-barrel cylinder conical tank.
A little bit different.
So I think that's where it comes from. So what happens is in the homebrew environment, we can sort of mimic this by actually putting PSI, carbon dioxide pressure, in the beer, or retaining some of the pressure that's being built up in fermentation. So that same type of pressure, that's more of a gas pressure on the system, it slows yeast activity. It retards a little bit the process and it slows down. So you can suppress some of those yeasty flavors at the expense of having a slower fermentation, but you can compensate for that slower fermentation by fermenting at a slightly higher temperature. So you can apply some pressure to your fermenter and ferment at a higher temperature so you can ferment a little faster, but not get the higher ester load that you would expect to get if you ferment warm, right? Or not just esters, but also some of those higher alcohols that give you the not so great morning afters with certain beers that are fermented too hot, right?
Yep.
So lagers tend to be better candidates for this because lager yeasts, I think just because of the fact they are bottom fermenters. Yeah. I think they adapted and evolved. They had selective pressure put on them such that they perform well under pressure anyway. So you can be using more pressure on a lager yeast and get better activity. Remember, they normally are going to ferment in the 50-55 range. So if you ferment them at, say, 65 F under pressure, now they're really going to be happy as far as like having more temperature to work at. Most lager yeasts are sort of seem to be naturally resistant to the pressures. So I think that's one of the things that benefits them. Unlike ale yeasts, most ales, the whole point of brewing ales is that ester profile sometimes, especially in the areas, things about like English ales, Belgian ales. So using pressure fermentation on ale strains on ales in general is going to be sort of application specific. So maybe not so much in your English strains, your Belgian strains, but there are some advantages to using pressure, such that maybe hoppy beers, by using a little bit of pressure, the fermentation isn't as vigorous, so you're not going to off-gas as much of the volatile aromas that we're looking for. So in an IPA, hop head-centric world, I think that's one of the things that has driven the desire to try pressure fermentation.
Makes sense now.
Because this idea of keeping it all inside.
Sure.
But another thing you could do with other styles of beer in the ale category is to like apply pressure late in the process. I don't really view this as late. I don't really view this really as pressure fermentation, applying it after fermentation has started, but this is something that a lot of the literature points to is you could get your fermentation started 24, 48 hours and then put some pressure on the system to start retaining some of that CO2. So if you set up to have, say, 12 psi, like my kegerator, I serve at 12 psi. So that's sort of where the CO2 in the beer is going to equilibrate. So as fermentation's ending, you could ramp up the temperature, apply that pressure, and a lot of that CO2 is going to be retained, dissolved in the beer, because that's how you carbonate beer, is you put it under pressure at lower temperatures. So you can do it that way, and that's one of the advantages for in the ale world, at least, if you really want to use pressure fermentation, would be, you know, to be able to retain some stuff and get some pre-carbonation from when the beer is done. And some people talk a lot about, you know, I haven't witnessed this where I buy CO2, but there have been cases of some CO2 shortages. So if you're blowing off all the CO2, you might as well try to capture some of it in the beer for being carbonated. And then you just need to figure out how to pressure transfer, not just close transfer, but you got to pressure transfer. If you don't have pressure on the receiving end, it's just like opening a beer and pouring it. It's going to be foaming in the receiving keg. So you've got to balance that pressure a little bit. So what do you need to do this equipment-wise? Obviously, they sell super fancy fermenters that have got, tri-clamp fittings or ball lock fittings on the top so that you can put devices on there to help you with the pressure. What you really want to do is you're not necessarily taking a CO2 tank and adding pressure. You're letting that evolved CO2 from fermentation create the pressure. So you need to have what's called a spunding valve, and that will go on top of your keg.
Yep.
And what a spunding valve is, it's got a pressure valve on it and a twistable dial-in like needle valve that you just set it to what you want, 12 psi, whatever, somewhere in there, and that's how it works. So you can buy a fancy fermenter to do this. Uni-tanks are really cool for that stuff. But on the cheap end, if you're already kegging beer, using a corny keg, fermenting in a corny keg is the way to go. You can just get a spunding valve that attaches to the gas out connector, hook that up, and do it that way. That's probably the cheapest, fastest way to get into pressure fermentation. So my final thoughts on that. So anyway, the technique would be, you want to be between 5 and 15 psi, right?
Okay.
So for ales, you probably maybe want to be at that lower end, where I know lager yeast will definitely take up to more psi, so you're sort of carbonating the beer from the get-go at that higher level. You probably don't want to ferment higher than 5 or 10 degrees Fahrenheit than what you normally would. You don't need to. This isn't a solution for, say, now I'm going to ferment at 85, 90 degrees, right? We have other solutions for that problem if that's how you have to go. Maybe you'd use Kvik yeast or something for that, and I wouldn't worry about the pressure ferment at that point. So for me then, in the grand scheme of things, it's not, to me, a universal solution. You're going to have to experiment with what styles and what yeast strains behave. There's no, you're going to have to experiment a little bit. The other ideal too is the ideal pressure is going to be strain dependent. So different strains are going to react differently. So you're going to want to use different amounts of pressure for different strains. It's going to take some experimentation too. Now, my last thought on this is, with things like Kvik available, and like Weihenstephaner, the W3470 lager yeast strain does really well all the way up to 70 degrees. Doesn't seem to throw a lot of esters and stuff like that, and ferments pretty fast, on its own. Even though it's a lager strain, if you ferment it at 65, 70 degrees, it's going to ferment relatively quickly. So to me, a little bit of pressure fermentation is, and this is a perfectly okay part of the hobby, but it's sort of like a solution looking for a problem. If you want to ferment warmer to go faster, you can use Kvik. If you want to make a lager, a lot of people are making great, we'll call it a pseudo lager, with W3470 at higher temperatures and not worrying about pressure fermentation. I think the best advantage for using a spunding valve is to capture CO2 for carbonation. And that's what I'm most interested in. I'll probably give that a try in a few batches in the future, is just trying to, like, how carbonated can I make the beer before I'm actually ready to put it in the serving keg. I think that's really the best utility for this. But as far as like fermentation goes, it certainly works, and a lot of people are using it that way, but you can still get the same product with all the other techniques that we've already learned. So to me, again, it just sort of seems a little bit, for my money, my time, effort, it just seems to be a little bit cart in front of the horse.
I see. So, I mean, I think that I think the one point that you pointed out was that would pressure fermentation lock in some of those volatile hop aromas that if you're really trying to focus on getting some of those delicate notes into your hop forward beer, would pressure fermentation be a solve for that?
It might be.
Yeah.
It might be, but again, I always come back to this idea of, do we have a universal problem of IPAs not being aromatic enough?
But who knows?
Right?
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
yeah,
The solution to that problem is more dry hops.
Yeah.
And we're already at that, you know what I mean? So I don't know, like, does a pressure fermentation give you 50% more hop aroma, or does it give you 0.5% more hop aroma?
Or does it give you hop aroma that you wouldn't get in other situations?
Yeah, maybe.
So I guess is my question.
Yeah. I tend to think scientifically, when I really think about it, probably not, right? I mean, you have to off-gas at some point. You're off-gassing. You're still off-gassing. You're going to build up more pressure than the 12 psi or whatever you're doing. So, and if you're fermenting at a warmer temperature, that affects solubility too, right? So you're still going to stay volatile. It's going to be in the headspace. It might actually be in the beer anyway, right? And that's how I'm thinking about it scientifically. So that just would make sense to me.
Yeah. Hey, I'm just playing devil's advocate.
I think that's great.
I'm trying to figure it out.
That's what science is all about.
Yeah. All right, good. All right, so that is everything you wanted to know about pressure fermentation from these Brew dudes. Certainly look up more information about yourself and also give it a try. I mean, just because, as Mike said, maybe this is a solution looking for a problem. I still think that if you are looking to try it out and see what's up. Because I don't know. I'd like to try it myself. And certainly, like, if you're trying to save some CO2 for your own carbonation later on, give that a try too. All right, so if you have questions or you have comments or just experience with pressure fermentation, leave them in the comments below here on the old YouTube video page. And or if you have any questions, leave those there too. Thanks for watching. We appreciate your time. Give us a thumbs up if you like this particular video. Subscribe to our channel because we do this kind of thing every single week. It's all about homebrewing with these two dudes. For John and Mike, brew-dudes.com. Brew on.
Cheers.